would like to take the approach of a theologian for the Christian spiritual approach. As we have started and we read that we should be approaching mental health from a mindset not only that God is the creator, or God exists and He is the creator of this soul that we're dealing with, but also He's the redeemer of it. So, like I warned several times, from us being engaged in an approach where we are addressing the culture that has neglected mental health for many, many time and generations. I'm warning us from falling into, which is sometimes is the case in many historical situations, where we approach something, and since we are so defensive of that thing, we fall into the other side. And my main message for us today is this, is I don't want us to fall into that. So I want to talk for the next 15, 20 minutes or so about the theology of mental health, if you will. What do we mean by theology of being mentally healthy? So, let's start from the basic Christian human anthropology, and pardon my writing, and this is not a fancy drawing, but just a diagrammatic. And I have to give credit to all this drawing to a clergyman, his name is Father George, from another Orthodox church. But in his presentations, he shares a lot of what I wrote in my little article, and I'm using his drawings or his ideas. So the Christian human anthropology is based that we have a body that is seen and we're all familiar with, that consists of organs like the eye, the heart, the brain. But we have an immaterial part of us that we call the soul. And we have discussed that God has breathed into the soul to make it connected to Him. And we have studied the connection between the three of them by saying that God put in the brain chemistry and biology and anatomy that links us with mental powers to live for Him, to live by Him. So we want to envision this as a system that God has given for us to reach this side of it, which is God Himself, experience Him, experience His love, experience existence and life and fullness of it. That's why Christ in John 10:10, which is when He spoke about Himself as the Good Shepherd, He says, I came to give you life and give it to you more abundantly. What that means is that He had already said, I'm life, right? But then He's saying, I came to give you the abundant life, the fullness of it. So if you're looking for the fullness of life, the meaning of life, if you're looking for good mental health, I will be the way, and I want you to experience me, and experience that through love, both to me and to each other. And therefore, and then only, you will experience life in its fullest, in its abundance. That's the theological approach of what we do. I'm tempting to throw this away. That's not at anyone. I'm not getting a mental fit or anything. Can I not use it? I think I'm loud enough.
Can people hear in the back without the mic?
Yeah, I think I'm loud enough. Yeah, so God wants us to experience Him, His love, and therefore, then only we will experience the best out of life. Then he draws this, Abuna. He says, human awareness, we all, in our awareness, we're moving up this slope. We have senses that are part of the body. We have a soul that have at least three main powers that I spoke earlier about. That's the intellectual power, the emotional power, and the willpower that enables us to experience reality. And we have a spirit, the breath of life that God breathed into the system so that it becomes empowered by a divine power. It's called the grace. God gave us all of that for one reason, to experience reality in a way that leads us to the fullness of life. Go up that hill to experience Him and life more abundantly with joy and love. And we're all struggling through that awareness slope. On the other extreme of that slope is quite the opposite. We're pulled down towards nothingness because we are originally created from nothingness. And that's a theological statement that Athanasius the Great mentioned in his book on the Incarnation. He said, since God created us from nothingness, when we lose Him, we tend backwards towards nothingness. Nothingness. Death. Emptiness and despondence. The exact opposite of the words up there. And that's our struggle in life. But then, in the middle of that struggle, we have to go through pain in order to cross that line. That's why the cross is there. The cross represents the pain that it takes to face obstacles and cross that up the hill, going up the hill towards the godliness, livelihood, fullness of life, joy and love. And that's when we face the most the core of emotional problem that we all face is called fear. Fear precedes that pain. In other words, we look at the cross and we're afraid to cross it. We're afraid to pick it up. So we get inside of us an emotion of fear. And that becomes the core of our negative emotions. That takes us to something called the 7 deadly sins. Have you heard of them before? Anybody? There's so many literature about, so many church fathers spoke about the 7 deadly we call them the passions. In Arabic, al-ahwa. Al-ahwa, something deep inside of us that becomes a maladaptive behavior or a maladaptive emotion. It all starts with fear. We are afraid to cross that painful awareness to reach godliness and happiness and joy. That fear usually is one of those things: fear of death, fears of pain, fear of shame, fear of being unknown, belittled, guilt, fear of boredom. Our kids now are very scared of boredom. And that's why they are all on the little machines all the time, because they can't face that inner emptiness. They have to be engaged in something that takes them out of that fear of facing reality. Remember that we are climbing the mountain of awareness. Now, the 7 deadly passions develop all out of that fear. In other words, without God, when we are disconnected from Him, we're lost. We feel like we are afraid, because the system to begin with was created with God empowering it. So if you cut off God, what develops is called fear. Why? Because now I feel alone in this life, and I'm facing a lot of reality obstacles, a lot of crosses in the road. So I'm within me, there is fear. And we have to deal with fear with one way or another, and it leads to the 7 deadly passions. Depending on what we're going to face fear without God. So if we're distant from God, we're going to have to deal with fear one way or another. So some people say, I can do it all. They fall into pride. I don't need God. I can deal with fear on my own. And then we see how pride is one of the core, the ego is one of the deepest problems, spiritual and psychological problems. Pride, the ego. And it's an attempt to shut off fear instead of going up the hill through the cross to God. One way is to say, I can do it. I don't need Him. I don't need to go up the hill. I can sustain myself. And that is the biggest lie. You know what they call fear? I wrote it up here. Did I? Yes, up here. False expectation appearing real. False expectation appearing real. I think that I can overcome fear by one way or another, but it's the biggest lie. I think I can do it by my own. I fall into pride. And then pride can lead to one of two things. Either manipulating others, what we call lust, or attacking others. It's called envy. Lust is using people for your own interest. That's a broader term for lust that includes all the sexuality things, the lying, the deceit, abusing people. Envy, when you want what someone has, but instead of manipulating them, you're using them, you're destroying them. Like they did with Christ. They envied Him and they crucified Him because they couldn't reach Him through God, through Him. So the 3 deadly sins so far is fear, pride, lust, and envy. Then lust can be take 2 forms. either gluttony where you use material things. Instead of using people, you're using material things, either food or drugs or alcohol. Or the negative approach, which is basically, I'm going to sit down and let everyone else serve or do my job, slothfulness. These are all attempts to defend against fear, attempts for the human soul to sustain itself from climbing up the mountain through the cross towards the fulfillment of life, godliness. On the other side, envy can take one of two things: either greed, where you have what people need, but since you are secure, you say, I'm secure and I'm unsatisfied, I will not share. I'm insecure, sorry. Since I'm insecure and fearful and unsatisfied by what I have, I will just, what hoarding? Hoarding is taking things that you don't even necessarily need or want to use, but you just feel comfortable. You don't want to share anything. And that's an attempt to feel better about yourself. Not you, but we see all of this that go to the clinical part. So what I'm saying in this section is not necessarily the clinical, chemical part of things, but the spiritual core issues that happens in the soul. Or you take it out on people by anger. When you feel that people are not doing what they should do, that the term shoulding, someone is shoulding on himself. Like he thinks like everybody should do this, should do this, should do this. When I'm driving the road and someone cuts me off and I was like enraged. Doesn't he know who I am? I'm Buna, I'm going to a meeting. How dare him do this? He shouldn't be doing this. And that's when we get angry. So, in an attempt to live our lives, we tend to take one of those, or two or three, or sometimes all of them, to live by, in order to avoid the pain of facing our reality, our fears, and going up to God. The problem, the clinical problem, and here I'm going to touch on the question back here. Am I too depressed to pray? What is the orthodox understanding of depression and anxiety? I will end by closing by, we all know clinical depression and anxiety. There are criteria for clinical depression and anxiety, and there are biological markers for them. But if you want to understand what the spiritual background or explanation, look at this theory of where we live, how we live our lives, and how can it contribute to being clinically depressed. If you look at the 7 deadly sins, and you apply anxiety and depression on it, you will see that anxiety is like fear right there. Right? So there is a relationship between living a lifestyle and then falling into this. Now, going back to the question that I started with, how to balance? Remember that question from the guy who asked me, I'm cowardly, I'm going to be thrown in the lake of fire. How does that sit in this explanation? Now we have to be very careful because there is a chemical, even genetic component of mental illness that interplays with this theological phenomenon. And it needs a clinical, spiritual diagnosis to balance those two, and to find out what is the best advice you give to each and every case. Because you can say that this lifestyle is contributing to fear and anxiety and depression. Here you can have slothfulness and despondency and overeating, even hoarding. That could be part of the mental illness. But there is a fine line between calling this a mere spiritual problem versus a clinical psychiatric diagnosis. And that's what we are here for. We have to be very careful. And like I started saying, that a lot of times I find myself pulling out my prescription pad, and another times I find myself pulling out my cross and a ointment, the unction. Those two. A lot of times I take that person and lead him up to that hill in repentance and loose all these attachments. And that would be the main course of the action. And a lot of time, no, you're doing everything fine, but you need that medicine to push you. And a lot of time, both are needed. Both are needed. You need to give that push, whether it's medicine or psychological, through therapy, or that leading that person into uniting back with God, and knowing and understanding what is the purpose of life, and finding the truth. God, Christ, He meant it when He said, "I'm the truth." A lot of here are lies. Fear is false expectations. It's lies. Okay? There's a lot of lies out there. So part of it is to come to the truth, the reality of the existence of Christ, the redeeming work of Christ, and also the way and life. I hope I introduced to you a fine-tuning between those two extremes today, because I didn't want us to take one and leave the other. And I wanted us to understand both angles and both approaches in a little bit of with depth. Thank you very much.
Questions for Abuna specifically, please raise them now. We might actually make a slight modification to the schedule and jump into a Q&A with everyone, since you're not Abuna with us now. But if you have a question maybe on this talk,
I have 1 minute in my schedule.
Use that minute wisely to make it a really good question. No questions. You don't have any questions.
So let's wrap up, and then I will stay for, I still have a couple of hours to stay.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Abuna. Just one more hand for Abuna. Just really appreciate his time. We're going to take another quick breather, and there is coffee, tea, some fresh veggie snacks. You can have as many cucumbers as you want. And actually, before we do that, because some people have asked me, this is cool you guys are doing this, but like, what is all this stuff? Like, what are these funny banners? So we're very fortunate, and that we have a couple of the leadership from the organization that sponsor this, which, by the way, is like taking a little bit of a hit. I know it was expensive to have the day, but it's like a nice place, and Samana thankfully really sponsored this. So I'm just going to ask Dr. Haney and Dr. Michael Karas to just give us share with us a little bit about what Samana is and how we can be a part of that work. So welcome them, please. Give them a nice time.